Snow drifted in heavy veils across the valley, swallowing the horizon in white silence. The wind carried a biting edge, sharp enough to cut through wool and bone, and each step broke the crusted surface with a hollow crunch. She pressed forward, her breath a ragged cloud, lashes thick with frost, her coat no more than a threadbare barrier against the deep cold. Somewhere in the timberline, wolves sang their lonesome hymn, their voices piercing the storm, and she felt the sound shiver down her spine like a warning. Yet she did not stop. Hunger and shame were worse companions than any wild beast. Ahead, a faint glow blinked through the storm, the square light of a cabin window. It stood dark against the snowdrifts, solid and unmoving, a refuge carved into the wilderness. She quickened her pace, boots sinking deep into the powder, her shoulders trembling with exhaustion. At the door, she hesitated, hand hovering above the latch. Pride wrestled with desperation. For weeks, she had turned away from begging. Yet the storm clawed at her resolve, and tonight, pride would not keep her alive. Her knock was faint, barely audible beneath the wind, but the door opened all the same. He filled the frame, tall and broad, his outline rough-hewn like the mountain itself. The fire behind him caught the iron in his beard, the hard line of his jaw, and the steady gaze of eyes that did not soften. Snow clung to his fur-lined coat and gathered in the ridges of his boots, but he looked untouched by the storm, as if it bowed around him instead of against him. "I don't ask for charity," she said quickly, her voice hoarse from cold. "Give me work, and I'll earn my place." His silence was heavier than words. He studied her, his gaze sweeping over her worn gloves, the sagging hem of her skirt, the way she stood with her weight against the doorframe, as though her body could no longer carry her burden. At last he stepped aside. The warmth of the cabin spilled outward, wrapping her in the scent of wood smoke and pine resin. She crossed the threshold, boots dripping melted snow onto the plank floor. Inside, the space was simple, a wide hearth with flames licking the stone, a rough-hewn table scarred with use, pelts draped over the chair backs. Everything bore the mark of solitude and survival. He closed the door with a firm push, shutting out the storm, and for the first time in days, she felt the sting of warmth on her cheeks. "Sit," he said, his voice low and spare. She obeyed, lowering herself onto a stool by the fire, her hands stretched toward the flames, trembling from more than the cold. Shame pricked at her skin with every flicker of heat. She wanted to explain herself, to speak of why she wandered alone, why no town would welcome her. But his silence pressed her words flat against her tongue. "I can sew," she murmured instead. "Mend your shirts, patch your boots. I can haul water, split kindling, whatever you ask." His eyes lingered on her, steady as stone. She felt small under that gaze, as if it could see through the thin armor of her voice to the hollow beneath. Still, he gave no judgment, no kindness, only that unreadable quiet. The storm rattled against the windows, snow piling in drifts along the sill. Somewhere outside, the wolves howled again, closer this time, their voices threading through the wind. She wrapped her arms tight around herself, fighting the shiver in her bones. The barn would be shelter enough, she told herself. She had endured worse. Better to lie among hay bales and shadows than to risk a man's pity or suspicion. "Let me sleep in the barn," she said softly. "I ask nothing more." His brow shifted slightly, though his face remained carved in silence. He did not answer, not at once. Instead, he lifted a kettle from the hearth and poured steaming water into a tin cup. He set before her, the steam curling upward, carrying the bitter scent of pine needles steeped in snowmelt. She cupped in both hands, the heat sinking into her palms, and for a moment her eyes closed against the ache of it. "You'll work," he said finally. His tone held neither mercy nor threat, only certainty. She nodded, relief sliding across her shoulders like a fragile cloak. Work she could manage. Work meant she was not begging, not worthless. The minutes stretched long, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the keening of the wind. She sipped the bitter drink, each swallow scratching her throat, and thought of the barn, cold, rough, distant from this fire. She thought, too, of the wolves threading through the storm, their hunger as sharp as her own. Yet she did not speak again. When he rose, his shadow filled the room. He took down a lantern from its hook, the flame within flickering gold across his hands. For a moment, he studied her again, as though measuring the weight of her words against the shape of her fear. Then he lifted the latch. Cold air surged in, carrying the scent of pine and snow. She stood, setting the tin cup aside. Pride straightened her spine, though her body longed for rest. She would walk into the cold, into the barn, and she would not ask for more. As she stepped past him, the lantern cast her shadows across the snow, his tall and steady, hers thin and wavering. The barn waited, a dark silhouette against the drifts, and from the trees beyond came the soft, restless call of wolves. She drew her coat tighter, each breath sharp in her chest. The man's silence trailed her, heavy as the snow pressing against the roof. In that silence lay judgment, perhaps, or perhaps something deeper, hidden like the fire beneath the ash. She did not dare wonder. Not yet. The barn door groaned as he pushed it open, lantern light spilling across the straw-strewn floor. The scent of hay and leather rose up, mingled with the bitter bite of winter air. He set the lantern on a beam, its glow faint but steady, and left her standing in the dim warmth of beasts long gone. "This will hold," he said, his voice rough in the stillness. She gave a small nod, throat too tight for words. He turned then, boots crunching back toward the cabin, leaving her alone with the shadows and the distant song of wolves. She sank onto the straw, its prickles sharp against her palms, and lay back with her coat wrapped close. Through the cracks in the wall, snow swirled like ghosts. She closed her eyes, whispering into the dark, half to herself, half to the wilderness. "I'll sleep by the fire with the wolves if I must." The barn answered only with silence, but somewhere in the storm, she thought she heard a steady step return to the cabin door, and the echo of her words lingered, waiting for the day he might answer them. Morning broke pale and brittle, the kind of light that carried no warmth, only a reminder how cold the world could be. She rose from the straw in the barn with her limbs stiff, her breath a thin veil in the air. Her fingers ached as she pulled her coat tighter, though it did little to keep the chill from gnawing at her bones. Outside, the snow lay deep and sharp, and the wolves had left their prints close to the door, as if circling to test her courage. When she pushed the barn door open, he was already there. The mountain man moved with the slow certainty of someone who had long ago made peace with solitude. He carried an axe, its blade bright against the dawn, and without a word, he set it against a round of frozen wood. The crack of the split carried across the yard, echoing against the pines. She stood still, unsure whether to step forward or hold back, until his eyes lifted from the task and found her. "Water first," he said. His voice was gravelly from disuse, but there was no edge in it, only a weight that expected obedience. She nodded quickly, gathering the empty bucket stacked against the wall of the cabin. The well stood a ways off, rim crusted with frost, rope stiff with ice. Her hands burned from the cold as she drew the rope hand over hand, the wooden bucket groaning as it broke the surface. The water gleamed dark and glassy, the weight pulling against her small frame. Twice she stumbled in the snow, and each time she swallowed her frustration, tightening her jaw. When she set the buckets down by the cabin door, her arms shook from the strain, but she said nothing. The days fell into rhythm. She mended his shirts by the firelight, her needle flashing faintly as she drew thread through worn seams. She split kindling with trembling wrists, her palms blistered and raw. She scrubbed the soot from iron pots until her shoulders ached. He did not praise her, did not scold her, only watched with that same quiet intensity, as though testing not her skill but her endurance. At night, she returned to the barn, curling in her coat with the straw beneath her. The wolves sang from the ridge, their howls threading through the trees, and each time she whispered into the darkness, "I'll sleep by the fire with the wolves if I must." The words became a vow, a shield against weakness. When she ventured into town with him for supplies, the stares met her first. The whispers followed. Women at the well turned their faces but not their ears, murmuring behind cupped hands. Men leaned on porch rails, their laughter sharp as broken glass. She begged him for work. They said, "She's nothing but another stray, too proud to beg for food." She kept her chin high, though her cheeks burned hot beneath the frost. He heard it too. She could see it in the tightening of his jaw, the way his hand curled around the sack of flour he carried. Yet he never repeated their words, never asked her to explain. He walked beside her in silence, his shadow long across the snow, and that silence was heavier than their gossip. Back at the cabin, she worked harder, as if each stitch, each cut of wood, might silence the voices in her own head. She told herself that labor was dignity, that as long as her hands moved, no one could call her useless. But at night, when her body ached and her skin carried the sting of cold, doubt crept in. Did he see her as the town did? A burden, a beggar, a soul with no place of her own? Once, as she bent over a shirt too torn to mend, her needle slipped and bit her finger. A bead of blood welled, bright against the pale fabric. She pressed it to her lips, trying not to wince, but when she glanced up, his eyes were on her. He said nothing, only crossed the room and placed a strip of cloth beside her hand. The gesture was small, almost careless, yet her chest tightened at the weight of it. She bound the cut in silence, fingers trembling less from pain than from something she could not name. The wolves grew bolder as the winter deepened. Their howls came nearer, circling the barn, scratching faintly at the edges of her sleep. She told herself they were only beasts, but in their voices she heard something familiar, loneliness, hunger, the restless ache of survival. They became her companions, their cries answering her own whispered vow. And though she feared them, part of her found kinship in their wild persistence. One evening, after a day spent hauling water and splitting wood, she sat by the barn fire with her coat drawn tight, watching sparks drift upward into the dark. The snow muffled every sound but the wolf's song and the slow crunch of his boots approaching. She did not look up until his shadow fell across her. "You'll freeze here," he said, his tone flat, but carrying the faintest edge of reproach. "I'll manage," she answered, though her lips were numb and her fingers stiff. "Better the fire and the wolves than pity I haven't earned." For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence pressed between them like another wall of snow. Then he turned, his boots retreating across the yard, and she was left with only the fire's crackle and the wolves' chorus. She pulled her coat tighter, her heart pounding with shame and defiance. Yet beneath that, hidden deep where she could barely touch it, flickered something else. His words had not carried judgment, only a strange weight she did not understand. When she lay back in straw that night, she stared through cracks in the wall at the falling snow. Her breath rose in pale threads, weaving with the cold air, and she thought of the lantern he had set beside her that first night. He had not sent her away, though the town would have. He had not repeated their words, though he had heard them. The wolves howled again, their cries rolling down the mountainside, and she whispered her vow once more. "I'll sleep by the fire with the wolves if I must." But this time, the words carried less defiance and more weariness, as if part of her longed to believe there was another answer waiting in the silence. The blizzard came down without warning, a wall of white sweeping through the valley, smothering the trails, burying fences, and locking the world in silence. The barn groaned under the weight of snow, the cracks in its boards no match for the storm's fury. She tried to curl deeper into her coat, but the cold pressed through until her bones ached. By dusk, the howling of wolves had been swallowed by the greater howl of the wind itself, and she knew she would not last the night among the straw. Pride could not keep her warm, nor could it shield her from the storm clawing its way inside. When the cabin door opened, spilling firelight into the white dark, she hesitated. He stood there, lantern in hand, his beard rimed with frost. The snow clung to him, but he looked unshaken, as though the storm was nothing more than another weight to carry. His eyes met hers briefly, then shifted to the barn wall bending under the wind. Without a word, he gestured toward the cabin. She followed, boots sinking deep in the drifts, the gale stealing her breath. Inside, the heat struck her face, too sharp after so much cold. The fire roared in the hearth, logs stacked high. Shadows leapt across the walls, long and restless. He set the lantern down, unhooked his coat, and hung it by the door, then turned to her. "You'll stay here tonight," he said. His tone carried no argument, only the weight of necessity. She wanted to refuse, to insist the barn was enough. But the storm cracked against the shutters like a whip. Her lips parted, But no words came. Instead, she moved closer to the hearth, the flames painting her cheeks with light and shame. He sat across from her, pulling a knife and a block of wood from the table. His hands were steady as he carved, shavings falling soft onto the floor. She threaded her needle through cloth, mending a sleeve she had taken up earlier, though her fingers shook too much for precision. The silence stretched long, filled only by the hiss of sap in the fire. At last his voice broke it. "Why do you wander alone?" The question landed heavy, as though he had been holding it back for days. She lowered her gaze to the cloth in her lap, the needle frozen in her hand. Her breath caught, then escaped in a sigh. "Because there's no place left that calls me theirs," she murmured. "I've been passed from one doorstep to another, told I wasn't worth the bread I ate. So I chose to leave before I could be cast out again." Her voice wavered, though she tried to steady it. The firelight caught the dampness gathering in her lashes, making them shine like ice. He didn't answer. The knife scraped slow against the wood, steady, deliberate. She wondered if her confession had fallen into emptiness, if he would turn his silence against her. But when he set the half-carved piece down, his eyes were on her, and they were not hard. "You've worked harder than most men I've seen," he said simply. "That is worth something." The words cut deeper than any insult, because they carried no flattery, only truth. Her chest tightened, heat rising not from the fire, but from somewhere within. She blinked, letting the needle slip through the cloth, her hands trembling. Outside the storm raged. Snow slammed against the roof. Wind howled in the chimney, and the wolves pressed close, their cries muted by the blizzard's roar. The walls shook with the weight of it. Yet inside the cabin, the fire's glow wrapped them both in fragile stillness. She dared ask then, her voice no more than a whisper, "Do the wolves ever come near enough to break through?" "They circle," he said, "but they fear the fire. It's the storm that drives them close." Her gaze flicked to the shutters trembling in the wind. The thought of those creatures prowling just beyond the walls sent a chill down her spine. She drew the mended sleeve tight in her lap and pressed her shoulders inward. "You don't fear them," she said softly. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw not just hardness but weariness behind them. "Fear is wasted out here. You learn to meet the world as it comes, or it takes you." She held his gaze, something unspoken stirring between them, heavy as the silence, fragile as a flame. The night deepened. She finished the sleeve, folded it carefully, and laid it on the table. He set aside his carving, the knife glinting once before vanishing into its sheath. When he placed another log on the fire, sparks leapt upward, painting the room in brief flashes of gold. The wolves howled again, closer now, their voices vibrating through the floorboards. She flinched, clutching her coat tighter. Her lips moved before she could stop them, shaping the words she had whispered night after night. "I'll sleep by the fire with the wolves if I must." The phrase slipped out, raw, trembling. She bit her lip, ashamed, but his eyes stayed fixed on her. His voice came low, steady as stone. "No," he said, "not tonight. You'll sleep by the fire. Yes, but not with the wolves." The flames cast his face in shadow and light, his jaw set firm, his gaze unwavering. She could not answer. Something inside her ached, fragile as the thread she held. She turned back to the fire, its warmth too much for her chest, and let the silence wrap them both once more. Outside, the storm screamed against the cabin. Inside, she felt the first crack in the walls she had built around herself, a crack warmed by firelight, steadied by a presence she had not expected to need. And though pride held her tongue, her heart heard the promise hidden in his words. Under the weight of the mountain night, the wind howled like some restless spirit, shaking loose the last brittle needles from the pines. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, yet its glow stretched across the room, bathing both man and woman in restless amber light. Clara sat on the edge of the bed she had not dared to claim fully, her shawl pulled close, her eyes fixed on the floorboards as if they held the answers to every unspoken fear. Elias stood near the door, his broad shoulders casting a jagged silhouette. He had not spoken for some time, though his gaze lingered on her in intervals, a quiet storm wrestling within him. She had worked all day with a stubbornness that would shame most men, splitting kindling, hauling water from the frozen creek, her hands raw and stiff. She had refused to be idle, and he had let her, though every strike of her axe had pressed against his patience. She was no settler's wife, no hired hand. She was a stranger who carried secrets, and secrets in the high country often came with a price. "You'll wear yourself thin," Elias said finally, his voice low, gravel bitten by the years. "The mountain doesn't care how much grit a person shows. It takes what it wants." Clara lifted her chin, eyes meeting his. "I'd rather wear myself thin than sit waiting for pity. You gave me shelter. I'll pay for it with work, same as a man would." He studied her a moment longer, then crossed the room, the floor groaning under his boots. He stopped near the hearth, crouching to stir the coals, sparks leaping like fireflies into the dim air. "I don't need a hand," he muttered, "but it seems I've got one anyway." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the snap of pine resin. Clara's heart thudded, heavy and unrelenting. She wanted to thank him, to confess why she'd come so far into this wilderness, but her words clung to her throat like burrs. Instead, Elias spoke again, softer this time. "What is it you're running from?" The question sliced the air clean. Clara stiffened, her fingers tightening around the wool of her shawl. She thought of the men who had cursed her name, the lies spun until her reputation was ragged beyond repair. She thought of nights hiding in barns, the sting of hunger, the sound of boots chasing her shadow. But she would not lay her shame bare, not yet, not here. "I'm not running," she whispered. "I'm surviving." Elias leaned back on his heels, his eyes searching hers with a weight she could scarcely bear. Surviving's one thing, but survival makes a person hard. Makes Em forget the difference between living and just keeping breath in their lungs. Her lips trembled, but she steadied them with a slow inhale. "And what about you? You've carved yourself into stone up here. Do you call that living?" The corner of his mouth twitched, though not into a smile, more like a grimace at the truth he couldn't deny. His hands, scarred and rough, pressed against his knees as he stood to his full height. "Maybe I forgot how. Maybe it's easier not to remember." Clara rose too, her slight frame dwarfed by his. Yet there was steel in her posture, a defiance that drew his gaze down to her with reluctant respect. The firelight painted her face in gold, softening the shadows beneath her eyes, but nothing could soften the resolve that lived there. "You gave me shelter, Elias," she said, her voice steadier now. "But shelter isn't just a roof. It's knowing you won't be turned out when the storm comes. It's knowing someone will stand at your side." The words hung between them, heavier than any snow the mountain could throw. Elias's chest rose and fell, the muscles in his jaw tightening. He had spent years in silence, years letting the wilderness wall him off from mankind. Now one woman, warm but unbroken, was tearing through those walls without even raising her hand. His breath came rough as he stepped closer, so near the scent of pine smoke and wool wrapped around them both. "You'll sleep in here tonight," he said, each word deliberate, unyielding. "Not by the door, not by the fire. Here." His hand gestured to the bed, to the space that had long been his alone. Clara's pulse raced, heat rising to her cheeks. "Elias." "Not as you fear," he interrupted, his voice sharper now, though not unkind. "You're not chattel, and I ain't the kind to take what ain't given. But the wolves out there don't wait for daylight, and the storm's rolling fast. If you think I'll let you freeze in the corner like some beggar, you've misjudged me." Her throat tightened, and for the first time since she crossed his threshold, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Not from fear, but from the jarring weight of being seen, of being treated as something other than disposable. She nodded, slow, careful. Then, "I'll trust you." The word struck him harder than he expected. Trust was a currency rarer than gold in these parts, and he had long stopped trading in it. He turned away before she could see the flicker of something raw in his eyes, pulling the quilt back and letting the chill of the night sweep into room for a heartbeat. As Clara lay down, the crackle of the fire softened, the storm outside pressing its icy fingers against the cabin walls. Elias settled beside her, not touching, not crowding, yet his presence filled the space like a shield. For a long while neither spoke, the silence between them shifting from tense to something else, something fragile but alive. And when the wind wailed loudest, rattling the shutters, Clara let herself inch closer, just enough that her shoulder brushed his arm. He did not move away. The mountain still raged beyond the timber walls, but inside, for the first time in many winters, Elias felt the stirrings of shelter not built by his own hands, but by the fragile courage of another soul daring to share it. And Clara, with her heartbeat echoing wild against the quiet, knew that survival alone had never felt like this.